2020 was the year of the empty arena match.
Welcome to Friday Night SmackDown on Fox.
They say wrestling isn't the same without the fans, and they're correct. When it comes down to it, the audience, that sea of humanity surrounding the ring, is as vital to wrestling as the grapplers themselves. They don't just watch the show, they're part of the show as well. Well, that was the general consensus until recently. When a global pandemic made hanging out in crowds a whole thing, suddenly every company was on a level playing field. Now nobody's shows were drawing shit. It was weird to have to get accustomed to those quiet shows at first, but we've learned that it is possible to tell stories without a live audience giving their immediate reactions. But after a while, the novelty of these empty arena matches began to wear thin, so companies had to do different things to break up the action, and one way to do that was by implementing more cinematic style matches. It's been the topic of a lot of scrutiny and debate for the last year, this increased use in pre-taped, chopped-up mini-movies that often take place outside the main arena. Some will argue that if something doesn't fit within a certain set of parameters, that it isn't real wrestling. But I believe that pandemic or no, these kind of matches have their place because of the nearly limitless creative choices they can make. Cinematic matches were around long before COVID, but the pandemic forced companies to draw from that well more often. And for good and for bad, they at least helped keep things interesting during that very weird year. And when I say for good and for bad, I mean it, because there were some great examples of what wrestling could do with the medium, while there were also some real stinkers as well. I recently sat down and watched these matches again, and I'm here to give you my rankings of all the cinematic matches from 2020. So real quick, what makes a cinematic match cinematic? Well, here's my criteria. For starters, the match is pre-recorded and there's going to be some edits and multiple takes, some more obvious than others. I mentioned earlier that a lot of these matches took place out in the field somewhere, but there were a lot that didn't. Also, the match's presentation is going to be different somewhat from the standard aesthetic. For example, filming in 24 frames a second instead of 30, a musical score, and different camera angles you would never see in a normal match. I thought long and hard about this one, but I decided not to include Eye for an Eye from Extreme Rules last year. You could call it cinematic since it involved a couple of different takes for the ending, but I'm going to rule it out because besides that one moment, everything else looks and feels the same. In my opinion, it barely qualifies compared to everything else, so I'm not going to put it here. And with that, let the ranking begin. Number 18, the swamp fight from the horror show at Extreme Rules. Not all these matches are great, but only one of them is so bad it basically put the entire cinematic concept on ice in WWE for months afterward. Here, Universal Champion Braun Strowman was being taunted by his former leader Bray Wyatt and decided to confront the devil in his own backyard and give him what for. What we ended up getting was well over 20 minutes of nonsense. Braun fights off random dudes only to get knocked out by himself. He wakes up in the middle of an endless Bray Wyatt monologue and gets bitten by a snake, beats up some more random dudes until one of them catches fire. He and Braun fight again and again and again until finally Strowman thinks he's won but appears to have never seen a horror movie before. There's another Bray Wyatt match on this countdown. I'm sure you're dying to know where I placed it, but one thing I will say about it right now is what I liked about that match was how Bray Wyatt's character used established moments from John Cena's past in an effort to destroy his spirit. The swamp fight tries really hard to do the same thing, but while Cena had genuine material to draw from, they tried to build Braun's backstory from scratch, hoping that fans were willing to go along with it. Long story short, they didn't. The swamp fight was easily the worst cinematic match of 2020, but at least it began one of the more captivating angles of the year with Alexa Bliss. Number 17, Sami Callihan vs. Ken Shamrock from Impact Rebellion Night 1. We saw a lot of weird, bad stuff happen in 2020, but then again, we also saw a lot of weird, good stuff too. Like when The Rock showed up on an Impact pay-per-view to induct Ken Shamrock into their Hall of Fame. Talk about a bingo card space for the ages. Ken's journey to the Hall began just before the pandemic took hold of wrestling, as Sami Callihan returned to TV to beat up Ken as his induction was announced. It all came to a head in the first of Impact's two-night Rebellion event with an unsanctioned match. What made this match unique was that it transitioned from a live-action style to a cinematic one midway through, a curious choice to be sure. From there, the referee just vanishes for a good portion of the match. I mean, I get that it's unsanctioned, but someone's got to determine a winner, right? Wait, what am I saying? The last match I talked about didn't even have a referee. OVE shows up to try and help Sammy, who ends up rebuking their aid. Then the action spills to the outside where Shamrock makes Callahan pass out from the ankle lock. I understand making your most recent world champion look strong in defeat, but it's unsanctioned. It doesn't count. I think it's badass that Ken Shamrock came back to the game after so many years out of the limelight, but overall there wasn't anything special about this fight. Certainly not so much it deserved to go cinematic. The music playing during the action was all this match really gained by going that route, and in my opinion, it's not a good enough reason to make that leap. Number 16, the backlot brawl from NXT TakeOver in your house. 1 month before the Swamp Fight killed WWE's interest in going cinematic for a while, NXT made their own case for the end of the experiment with their first and only backlot brawl in the history of the brand. Adam Cole kept his reign of dominance going by defending the NXT title against the Velveteen Dream, a man who began the year as a big babyface but who was slowed down by an injury and a speaking out accusation. Needless to say, he wasn't exactly a figure people wanted to rally around at the moment. Then it came time for the bell to ring, and in the end, it was a cinematic match for the sake of having one on the card. There was hardly anything they did here they couldn't have done in Full Sail with a no-holds-barred match. Hell, you still could have done a backlot brawl, just film it the same way you do everything else. Simply going outside is not an excuse to go to 24 frames a second. Oh yeah, and you couldn't see what they were doing half the time either. It played out like every other Adam Cole match during this time period. Some epic battle ending in undisputed fuckery, and the champion retains. Thanks, seen it. The only thing that could have saved this backlot brawl would have been some well-timed O.J. Simpson chase footage. Number 15, EC3 vs. Moose from Bound for Glory. In one of his first acts in post-WWE life, EC3 took his talents back to Impact Wrestling, where he confronted Moose and stole his self-appointed TNA Championship belt. EC3 was tormented by his past and saw the belt as a symbol of that past, so he felt he had to destroy it. But not on Mr. Impact Wrestling's watch. The action itself was slow and physical. No holds, no flips, just a personal vendetta playing out in a vicious brawl. While the match looked fine, I didn't really care for the music edits in this one, going back and forth from dark and dramatic to some French cold wave song. I just don't think it helped. In the end, Moose beat up EC3 to the point where the essential character gave Moose his blessing to carry the TNA banner, and that's how it ends. A curious bout that tries to bridge the gap between the latter days of the TNA era and the current world of Impact with a lot of extra drama thrown in. It's not great or terribly unique, but it's only here because somehow there are ones that are worse. Number 14, the Elite Deletion from AEW Full Gear. In 2016, Matt Hardy changed the game in professional wrestling with the debut of his Broken Persona. His trilogy of epic encounters at the Hardy compound, combined with his quirky character and his complete dedication to said character, made him one of the more popular guys of the decade. 4 years later, the Broken gimmick is all but retired, but it remains strong in spirit, as we saw with the Elite Deletion match at Full Gear when Matt faced off with rival Sammy Guevara at House Hardy. If you're a fan of the Broken universe of old, you'll probably enjoy a lot of the winks and nods to the past that are sprinkled throughout. The Hurricane and Gangrel's cameos are also a joy to watch, but unfortunately the Elite Deletion brought nothing new to the table, no new concepts introduced. It just relied too much on those little references. Not only that, somehow the production quality went way down from the standards we'd seen in Impact and WWE. You'd think TK could have thrown a bit more money at this one, yeah? Hardy wins in a manner that feels incongruous to the rest of the vibe of the match, right before jumping back to a humorous tone with Sammy being dumped into a garbage can. Its derivative nature, its scaled back production, and its inconsistent tone makes this the weakest of the Hardy compound matches. Number 13, the Street Profits Viking Raiders Brawl from Backlash. In what was originally billed as a tag team title match, what we got instead was a blow-off to the weeks of silly skits fans have been watching for weeks on Raw, and this backstage brawl featured a reminder of every single one of their original jokes, whether or not they were funny in the first place. This would involve the use of a prop or a simple flashback that everyone could see. Like the Elite Deletion, the tone is all over the place as they go from wacky stuff with bowling balls and turkey legs to broken glass spots with no rhyme or reason, like they're confused over how much they want the guys to hurt each other. And also like the Elite Deletion, the humor is derived way too much from callbacks to earlier gags instead of creating any new material. The only reason I'm ranking this one higher is that at least these jokes weren't quite as old. Well, that and the fact we got the debut of Akira Tozawa and his ninjas. Hi, Amas! Number 12, the Haunted House of Terror match from NXT Halloween Havoc. Cameron Grimes is one of NXT's real gems of the moment, and Halloween Havoc was his time to shine. Booked against Dexter Lumis in the Haunted House match, Grimes spent every moment chewing the scenery as he was repeatedly spooked by a variety of horror movie tropes, complete with fake-outs and jump scares, with the occasional bit of wrestling thrown in. Finally, Grimes can't take it anymore and hoofs it back to the Capitol Wrestling Center, where he's met again by the Zombies and Lumis until he's ultimately defeated. Like I said, this felt more like a one-man show with Cameron Grimes at center stage, his cowardly character exposed to the world to see. I think he did a good job running with it too. The first part of the match was a chore to get through because of a lack of any meaningful action, but the second part back in the ring picked up a bit. I appreciated the B-movie imagery they were going for at the beginning and end of the story, but you almost forget that it's a thing since nothing else about their production lends itself to that theme. And oh yeah, there was also a scene with an inaudible Michael Hayes, so that cameo sure was worth it.
So you went down the block, the better it got. You lived in the last house on the right.
The story of Grimes' intense fear of Dexter Lumis is told well enough, but compared to other cinematic matches here on this list, it lacks the depth or originality for me to place it much higher. Number 11, the tooth and nail match from AEW All Out. This match was the blow-off to weeks of taunting between Britt Baker and Big Swole, finally coming to a head with a brawl in Baker's own office. As I find with most of Baker's shtick, the MVP of this match was actually her lackey, Rebel.
Say hi to Mr. Thirsty! Don't touch
The Oklahoma girl.
Dr. Baker! In the dumpster! Receptionist Reba!
Rebel's comedy relief was great, but it was way too stark a contrast to the violence we were seeing between the two competitors. It always seemed as if one side was constantly diminishing the impact of the other. But props to Dr. Britt for sticking herself with a needle for a pay-per-view payday, and the match itself was a fitting end to the rivalry. For all the work these two ladies put in for the build, I'm glad AEW listened to the fans and promoted this from the pre-show to the main show. Number 10, Blackheart vs. Rebel Heart, one final beat from the April 8th NXT. You gotta feel bad for Triple H. The man spent years trying to expertly craft this twisted tale of friendship and betrayal between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. But whether it was due to injury or mostly due to injury, things always came to a halt when things were getting good. By 2020, the angle was finally coming to an end until COVID reared its ugly head and suddenly the big blow-off was going to have no crowd to enjoy it. Thus came one final beat, a brawl that took place both inside and outside. There's some great production value in this one. If these multiple camera angles and cuts were implemented in the Randy Orton Edge match at WrestleMania, that last man standing match might have been a lot more tolerable. On the other hand, this match is filled to the brim with overwrought, drawn-out dramatics that have come to define the Triple H Shawn Michaels brand of storytelling in NXT. Seriously, this fight is of they live proportions in terms of the action, the selling, and most of all, how long it feels. No one asked for a match this long, even if people could have been there to witness it. Candice LeRae pulling a Tori Wilson in WCW play at the end was a mercy killing. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad we finally got the payoff to this big storyline 3 years in the making, and those two guys worked their asses off there, but you could have cut the match time in half, and I think it would have been just as effective. Number 9, the bar fight from the July 24th SmackDown. Throughout WWE history, the bar has often been used as a setting for destruction. We've seen plenty of bar fights between wrestlers, and the APA once hosted a barroom brawl on pay-per-view in the arena for some reason. But not only is our next entry a proper match in a proper bar, it's thematically perfect. Sheamus bullying Jeff Hardy in storyline over his past problems with addiction is nothing new. We've seen it happen to Scott Hall, Jake Roberts, Rhino, and of course Jeff Hardy many more times. But I'm pretty sure it's the first time the angle was taken to its natural conclusion. It's a pretty entertaining brawl that takes advantage of its surroundings, and good lord, Jeff deserves a medal for going face first into a urinal during a health crisis no less. If you can look past Jeff using his magical face paint to begin his comeback, the spectacle is pretty fun to watch. Number 8, the Firefly Inferno match from TLC. You know the story. Randy Orton and The Fiend have a fight around some fire-spewing contraptions. Bray catches fire, dies from a single RKO, then Orton burns a crash test dummy to a crisp just to make sure he's gone. When I first watched this match, I was stunned by the ending. I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go with this, even if the body swap by Bray was blatantly obvious. But the more I went back and watched it, the more I realized there were a lot more cracks in the armor. I do appreciate how in many ways it plays out like a movie fight with a horror villain, right on down to the pacing and the camera cuts. But this is not a seamless production. There are a fair number of continuity errors that can kill the immersion of the match, most notably the rocking chair that suddenly becomes covered in strawberry jam, and of course Bray's body at the end. But I have to admit, the ending of the match itself is still the coolest thing to me. We've seen Inferno matches before where somebody's arm or foot catches fire and that's that, but seeing Bray's entire back ablaze was something else. And yeah, an RKO to a guy on fire is still the best version of that move I think we'll ever see. If anything, this match makes me want to see even more badass RKOs. I want to see him RKO a fucking bear by year's end. Make it happen! Number 7, Wrestle House from Impact Wrestling. What happens when a dozen wrestlers are forced by a demon to live in a house with cameras everywhere? You get one of the better experiments that wrestling saw in all of 2020. Some time alone between Rosemary and her love interest Johnny Bravo is thwarted when Taya Valkyrie plays third wheel, so Rosemary summons a handful of other characters to join them and no one can escape. Minor squabbles are settled in a ring in the backyard, and the whole thing is hosted by Tommy Dreamer, because in his words, you can't have a reality show without a host.
Match time!
The Wrestle House storyline played out on Impact for several weeks over the summer. I think it was a great exercise in seeing how all these different characters could interact with each other in a laid-back setting. It showed everyone's sense of humor, and a lot of gimmicks you wouldn't expect to blend together actually do so in a pretty charming way.
It's a couch, you idiot!
It showed that not every cinematic match has to involve a ton of fighting, and when it does, it doesn't have to be gritty or over the top. And of course, it showed that everything can be made better with a retro graphics package and a cheery pop tune. It's not very often you get a storyline with such a wide ensemble cast that takes advantage of all the characters' strengths and gives everyone an arc, but that's what we got with this show within a show. The whole thing ended with Bravo proposing to Rosemary and everyone getting teleported back to the Impact Zone. And of course, we all know what came later. Number 6, the Money in the Bank match from Money in the Bank. Early in the cinematic era, WWE really went outside the box with this Cannonball Run-esque contest that saw both the men's and women's briefcases on the line at once as the competitors raced to the roof to grab them. I initially applauded the match for its humor and creative use of the space in WWE headquarters, but the more I watched it back, the more I began to realize just how many leaps in logic there were in the match. Like, why couldn't they all just run up the stairs? Why was the building infested with random characters? Why couldn't Asuka and King Corbin just grab their own briefcases instead of fighting each other? Why give off the impression that Rey Mysterio and Aleister Black fell to their deaths when we can clearly see the crash pads in the wide shots? And more importantly, why was Dana Brooke so dumb that she thought the briefcase in the conference room was the one to grab?
Tell me where that briefcase is. Tell you that.
The roof! Dana, the roof! It was made perfectly clear, and you didn't need a definitely not there Stephanie McMahon to tell you that. But I keep going back to how I felt when I saw this match the very first time, the wonder I felt watching the back and forth between scenes. For all its issues, it was still unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I was very much there for it. As for the ending, Otis winning may have ended up being a dud, but at the time, I was just happy it wasn't Corbin again. Number 5, the Boner Yard and Ball for a Ball matches from Talkin' Shop-A-Manias 1 and 2. They were both really funny, and really bad, and really dumb, and really funny, and really dumb, and really bad, and really funny. I mean, seriously, nothing I say here is going to do it justice. Go watch the pay-per-views, it'll change your life. Number 4, the greatest wrestling match ever from Backlash. If you're Edge, how much does it suck for you to come back to wrestling after 9 years only for your first WrestleMania back to be in front of no fans? Well, 2 months later at Backlash, WWE tried to fix that the best they could with what they called the greatest wrestling match ever. Not only did they get the sprinkling of stand-ins at the Performance Center, we also heard the first case of canned audience noise of the year, predating the Thunderdome by months. And I thought the piped-in crowd noise was cheesy and obnoxious then. It was downright subtle here. It's a great match. These two guys do everything to each other over the course of 45 minutes, really exploring the space. Even after all that time apart, these two still have a great in-ring chemistry. But the match isn't without its faults. Though it's probably the wrestliest of all these matches, we get some unnecessary camera cuts that break the immersion of the match, and really pounds home the fact this is not a live production. The match tried to blend a current storyline that had deep roots with some other stuff from the past that had nothing to do with them. Throwbacks for the sake of throwbacks. The ghost of Howard Finkel, Charles Robinson in an old school ref shirt, legendary finishing moves. And that right there is the biggest stumbling block in this match. See, according to WWE, nothing can be great or the greatest if there isn't some element of the past tied to it. I get the sense that given how long Orton and Edge had been in wrestling, that this match was some kind of bridge between the two eras, but they could have easily done that on their own without injecting stuff from other people. It's the same kind of self-indulgence we saw between FTR and the Young Bucks last year when they started using classic tag team finishers as falsies. But despite all that, and even if it went a little bit longer than I'd like it to, we still got to see Edge back in the ring to wrestle one great match in 2020, and that reeks of awesomeness. Number 3, the Boneyard match from WrestleMania 36, Night 1. The first cinematic match of 2020 took the genre to new heights and set a near impossible standard for everyone else to follow. In this encounter, AJ Styles faces off with the Dead Man, who's been told for weeks that he's too old and domesticated to cut it anymore in WWE. They meet in the Boneyard, and after a series of close calls and interference from the Good Brothers and some Druids, Taker finally rids himself of the phenomenal scourge that is Styles, burying him alive and riding off into the night. It's a terrific story of the grizzled veteran showing he can still hang by beating the somewhat less grizzled veteran. The production of this match was superb. The cinematography, the lighting, the editing, the score, making the most of their surroundings, it was all very well done. AJ's never been the kind of wrestler I associate with brawls, but he played his role well. And if this truly is his final match, it was a perfect send-off for The Undertaker, a match that concealed his limitations and made him look more like the badass of old. The Boneyard match was a spectacular main event of the first night of WrestleMania and got the cinematic experiment off to a great start, but there was one more match that weekend still waiting in the wings. Number 2, the Stadium Stampede from AEW Double or Nothing. If you've been on this channel enough, you know I've gushed plenty about this match already, but let me tell you more. As we saw with Money in the Bank, it's a very elaborate endeavor to plot out stuff for 10 different guys in a single match across all points of the stadium, but they did a great job weaving it all together and keeping it entertaining, all without going to the well of cameo appearances. Everyone's got an arc and gets some really cool moments to shine. It is a very robust viewing experience with a lot of great action and some laugh-out-loud moments. What also makes this match so enjoyable for me is listening to the commentary team react to it, in particular Tony Schiavone. Now, Schiavone's been in wrestling for a long time, seen a lot of stuff, and it sounded like he was really loving this matchup. If that match can get Schiavone to pop, it's good enough for me. The Stadium Stampede showed you can have a multi-layered escapade of a match that brings all these stories together, with nods to the past that weren't overbearing, and effectively blend action and humor, resulting in arguably the biggest and greatest empty arena match in wrestling history. It's a lot of fun to watch from start to finish. Watching that match for the first time, and the second time, and the third time, made me forget about all the shitty stuff going on in the world for a moment, and it made me remember why I became a fan of wrestling in the first place. It's that wrestling is ridiculous. And my pick for the number 1 cinematic match of 2020 was the Firefly Funhouse match from WrestleMania 36, Night 2. From a purely technical standpoint or a feel-good perspective, the Boneyard match is superior to the Firefly Funhouse match, but for me, there are other factors at play here. The Funhouse match was a trip from start to finish. First, the odd visual of John Cena emerging to zero crowd noise, then the move to the Funhouse itself, all the way through to a methodical dissection of Cena's mind, body, and soul via flashbacks and cutaways. The match is arguably Bray Wyatt's magnum opus, a thorough takedown of the John Cena mythos and the perception of WWE's business model through the years, a showcasing of some of the company's biggest blunders laid bare. It's a match that presents WWE's side of the story while also offering valid counterpoints that challenge the company's perception. Other wrestlers in the past have taken shots at John Cena, making references to backstage scuttlebutt and rumor, but Cena was always able to take them down and dismiss the hate. This is the first time that I can think of where someone actually made those attacks on Cena's character, and it worked. You can count on one hand the number of times Cena has been soundly beaten since becoming a top guy. It was against Brock Lesnar in 2014, Bray Wyatt in 2020, and I'm pretty sure that's it. With Lesnar, we saw physical dominance, but in the Funhouse, Cena was repeatedly worn down mentally until he finally reached the breaking point, leaving him weak and vulnerable to the Fiend's final attack. As awesome as the Boneyard match was, it was a story we'd seen before. Old veteran can still hang with a young trash talker and rides off into the sunset. But what Wyatt did to Cena, this was new, this was different, it was totally uncharacteristic of WWE to even think about it. It's hard to come up with a more definitive way of writing somebody off, especially someone as rarefied as John Cena, but they managed to pull it off. Also, Cena jump cut out of existence at WrestleMania and has not been seen since by the time I'm making this video. AJ Styles was buried alive and came back to TV, 3 weeks later? It was a story 15 years in the making, with layer upon layer of subtext and double meaning. A match so creative and wild that Bray himself has not been able to replicate it. That's why the Firefly Funhouse match is my pick for the best cinematic match of 2020. So what did you think of this list, and how would you rank the cinematic matches of last year? I want to hear y'all sound off in the comment section below. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.